Thank you very much, Sue, and very nice to come along. I seem to have been talking to some of you for about 25 years about the future of the trade union movement, so there's a certain sense of déjà vu about this kind of occasion, and it's whether or not we've been successful in those 25 years might be reflected in the number of amount of grey hair that's in this room, rather than young people raring to go. And my ambition in life is to sit and listen to somebody under the age of about 30 giving this kind of talk that I'm about to give to introduce the discussion. And it's certainly true. I thought Sue rather unkindly dug out that next 50 years of the EU. It might be the next 5 minutes of the EU, the way certain things are going at the present time. There's of our discussions that we've been having over those 20 odd years talking about the future, there's some things that haunt us slightly. Things that we did and things that we didn't do that we probably should have done, and things where we should have put more emphasis and didn't, and so on. And I'm going to do my introductory remarks today with a sort of, as you get to my age, I think you're entitled to, a little bit of a reflection of some lessons, British and European, but apply them to the future. And starting from a statement, I don't know whether you saw a fantastically good article by Will Hutton in the Observer last Sunday. The best one I've read about this is not just a crisis of the euro or what's going on in the United States Congress. This is a crisis of capitalism, and he put it, I think, in the terms of a once-in-a-century crisis. And that's been the way I've been looking at it since 2008, 2007, 2008. The worst in a crisis, and this isn't going to be over in the next year or 2 years and so on. It'll see some of us out, and it could be a bit like the old biblical rhythms of 7 years of feast followed by 7 years of famine. We had a splurge of growth and consumption in particular, and in borrowing, that lasted over 13 years. Now, it doesn't have to be symmetrical with a period of famine, but it's likely to be a long, long time before the circumstances, economic circumstances, turn back to where they were up until 2007, 2008. So I started about 2008 having a look at what happened in the 1930s. What did our predecessors do when they were faced with a very similar set of circumstances? And how did they go on in the next decade, and in the 50s after that, to build a very strong trade union movement that was very, very influential? And I pick out a number of lessons. I'm not really going to talk about the short term, about the pensions crisis, about the public expenditure cuts, about rising unemployment. I'm taking it for granted that we all agree that they are the context against which we will be operating, as I say, for a longer period than I think that many people now think. It's not going to be changed by a general election. It's not going to be a new programme from the Labour Party that's going to come along and easily solve the situation that we're in. It's not convincing to anybody that somebody's got a magic formula. Even though we could be critical of the government, and I think Ed Balls is on the right lines on too much too soon in terms of the cuts, I do think that I think Christine Lagarde said yesterday, governments haven't got a lot of ammunition anymore to do much, and that is the true immediate problem that we face. Anyway, we might talk a little bit about the economic situation in the discussion period. But what did they do in the 30s? And it's very, very interesting. I mean, and it wasn't an overall plan. But the first thing they did, and led by Ernest Bevin, who, the more you read about the 30s, the greater figure in trade union terms it becomes, they firstly kept up the resource levels. They kept up the income. The membership went like that after the general strike. But the income went, as a proportion of wages, went up. And by 1938, average union sub was 2% of earnings. That was, just to say in contrast, by the late 40s, it was down to 0.3%. There'd been a period of wage growth in the war and the era of full employment that had come, but we let, collectively, the resource level fall. And instead of being, if not so many members, but rather well-heeled trade union movement, we became a much worse resourced and in a weaker financial position, perhaps, than we'd been in the 30s. Interesting to see former General Secretary of NUPE and successor organisation to ASSET, they're the two unions who got the blame for cut price unions subs in different debates that were taking place on that at the time. But keeping up the resource levels, if we're going to have less members, must we have less money? Must we have less funds? And the answer to that is no. Not if you can demonstrate you're doing a good job for the members concerned. So resource levels, and we are going to have less members. Unemployment is going to rise, and the public sector is getting a caning. We've lost 111,000 jobs in the last few months in the public sector. What did they do with the money? The first thing they did with the money was build up strike funds. Even though they were mainly on the moderate side, they weren't all on the moderate side. Bevin, again, it's hard to categorise where he was at this stage, but they built up a strike fund to frighten employers, to say we can strike, and we can strike for a substantial period. And the trend that we've had in the post-war period, away from strike funds, or rather small strike funds that frighten nobody and maybe rest on social security, because there wasn't the social security then, but there was determination to have a good strike fund. And the rationale for the subs increases that were necessary was, a lot of it was based upon the strike fund. So there was that. Building up resources, take us seriously, we've got some resources, we can sustain a fight. The second thing they did was sort of politically quite different, and that was in a period of deflation, which it then was, you were facing falling wage levels, cuts in pay across on a widespread basis. And there was competitive wage cutting between employers in the same line of business going on. And that led them, our predecessors, to think about, well, how do we stop that? And it gave a huge impetus to industry-wide bargaining, to the fact that with the better employers, who were doing okay, didn't want to get undercut by the worse employers, that alliances were then formed with the encouragement of the state. Interestingly, whichever party was in power, encouraged the formation of joint industrial councils and employers' associations and federations of unions at the national level. We've still got them in the public sector. There's one or two private sector industries who've got echoes of it anyway, in engineering, construction, and one or two others. But by and large, every bargaining in the post-war period decentralised. And once it decentralised, we were into having to get recognition one by one. We were into one factory there with members getting a lot more than one plant there, and so on. And the sense of solidarity between workers, I believe, in retrospect, I didn't realise it at the time. I was around for most of the period. But again, looking at what was appropriate in a period of growth was certainly not appropriate, or so appropriate, in the early 80s when we hit the Thatcher attack, because she was a decentraliser too, and is not appropriate, I think, today. But finding those alliances with a much smaller number of employers in industry, a much smaller manufacturing sector, and so on, is going to be extremely difficult. But they formed these alliances and the joint industrial councils. And the interesting thing in Ireland, which they did, which was beginning to go its own, I mean, it was independent, but was going its own way in some areas, they made those in at least 2 sectors, and have increased it, generally legally applicable. The agreement that was made between an employers association and the union was made applicable to all the employers in the sector. A bit like a wages council order would have been done in Britain. It was made generally applicable. So you could be a non-union guy out in the wilds of Donegal or whatever, the union came round, you had to observe the agreement, and there would be a labour inspectorate doing that. And that model, the generally legally applicable agreement, is in most of the continental European practices. I mean, we didn't want legally banned agreements and so on. But the idea that everybody in the sector is paying the same, at least minimum rates, was forced through in that way in those countries. And I think, I mean, you, the ones of the future, you've got to decide whether you're going to go down these routes as far as the future of the trade union movement is concerned. But it seems to me that when we are planning our period of with the Labour Party, what might follow on in terms of employment policy and labour market policy, these things are extremely relevant. I mean, are they going to help us in a way that the government helped, maybe the old Minister of Labour helped, in the 1920s and 1930s? That brings me to the Labour Party, and the Labour Party, 1931, total disaster scene, and so on. They, most of them, resolved to do 2 things. One is have a practical programme for labour that was a clear alternative. And in a way, it was kind of easier for them. I don't think it was easy at the time, but in retrospect, the model of nationalisation, the model of public planning, the model of incomes policy, these were in their minds. And the ones who were again, Bevin, particularly interested in these areas, that this is going to be the future. And it was very much a model which was encouraged by the very successful publicly owned industry called London Transport at that time, which was revered as the finest public transport authority anywhere in the world by anybody who saw it. The buses, the undergrounds, and so on. And the expansion that took place at that stage, the way it was done. All young people got day release up to the age of 18, quite a lot to 21. And it was a fantastically well-run operation, and to get a job there was to, in 1930s London, was to be a real member of the elite and to have achieved something, to be very, very, very proud of it. And by the way, the union membership was 100%. That was the model. It was back to a sort of union shop arrangement. And it seemed to me that successful models of alternatives are going to be important. Now, whether they can be done with local authorities, whether they can be done with the co-ops, whether they can be done with some NGOs, I don't know. But it seems to me that we will need some things to point to. At the moment, listening to the PFI debate yesterday, it's all a disaster, and the Conservatives are pinning it all, on all the hospital problems, on that, and on the Labour Party. Now, quite a few people in this room had plenty to say about PFI, but I was listening in vain for a Labour voice to defend the record yesterday. They didn't do it. Nobody came out. And Lansley is going to blame all the problems of many hospitals on that in the future. So they invested in the Labour Party was seen as an important, very important role, and the civil service unions and so on, not directly, they'd been forbidden from being in the TUC, never mind the Labour Party, after the general strike, but they contributed to some of the thinking that was going on in all kinds of ways. The fourth area that they played with was the union involvement in the welfare state. This is controversial and was controversial. The welfare state, originally, before the formation of the Labour Exchange by Lloyd George, unions, particularly craft unions, did an employment exchange function, and they were paid by the government to do that. They got public support. And Lloyd George, in fact, offered the Labour exchange idea to the Parliamentary Committee of the TUC, and they turned it down on account it wasn't their job. Their job was collective bargaining. It was not a cooperative exercise. Ernest Bevin thought that was a big mistake. And he offered it again, this time to the General Council of the TUC in the middle of the war. And they turned it down for the same reason, but also under pressure from the civil service unions who wanted to stay civil servants and didn't want to float off into some privatised, even, I don't know why they lacked confidence in the General Council of the TUC. I can't believe that was appropriate, but they seemed to, they wanted to stay with the devils they knew and so on. But, I mean, and this is where the European dimension comes in. It's pretty clear, if you're looking at European trade union movements, that those who have got the involvement in the welfare state are the ones with the highest membership. And they took on, they're up to the 60s, 70s, 80% in the Nordic countries, in Belgium, in Austria, where the rest of us, count us with the Germans and the Dutch, are somewhere around about the 25s, 26% union density, with now a worryingly large part of it in the public sector and a worryingly small part in the private sector. Now, how does that relate to where we are now? No one's going to give us the job centres to run. No, you never know. You never know. Somebody might come along and make an offer like that at some stage. But we've got the training engagement. We've got the training arrangements that have been developed. And I would say that with the next time when planning again for a Labour victory, what role do we want to play in that area? Are the things that we should take over or seek to take over? So, I mean, just to mention, I've been living in Belgium for 8 years. If you become unemployed or sick, you go to the union office for the money. And there's a union office in every place with more than about 3,000 people. Every community with more than 3,000 people. If you're not a union member, you still get the money from Brussels or Antwerp. And maybe 2 or 3 other places. You've got, 40, 50 mile journeys and so on. And there's a queue right round the block with all the immigrants arriving and God knows what, and so on. So for ease of convenience, the union is the place, and it builds it into the fabric of the society in a very, very important way. And of course, although the money is separated strictly, there are all sorts of advantages to the union movement as well. Now, that brings me to perhaps the final area I just want to put in these opening remarks, which is addressing this big problem where, at the moment, the left, in my perception, I don't know whether you agree, I've got very little to say about what kind of society we would like. In the 1930s, they had a very clear idea about the kind of society that they would like, what the alternative was. And that was what was in Labour's programme in the 1940s. But we haven't got a clear idea. We've compromised greatly by the love-ins with Murdoch and with the city, and that's going to take a long time to fade from the public imagination, and Lanslett and all these others are going to make sure they pin it on Labour in the period ahead, along with Iraq and no doubt Libya and God knows what else. These things will be thrust powerfully in the period ahead. And it seems to me that the way you can deal with some of that by developing an alternative vision. And what is it? What is that vision? And this is what just brings me back to the issue of Europe. I mean, there's a lot of, everybody's kicking Europe to death at the moment and hardly anybody defending it. But the reality is that although Southern Europe is clearly in trouble, by the way, if we'd have been in the Euro, we'd have been in exactly the same trouble as Greece and Spain and Italy. Our debts are enormous. We devalued by 25%. That was our great freedom. Not that it's done the British economy much good, by the way. It hasn't. We're still flatlining. And the advantages of not being in the Euro don't look so fantastic as far as I'm concerned. But the reality is there's other parts of Europe, Northern Europe, that are doing very well, apart from us, Ireland and Iceland. I put Iceland in for the purposes of the European Economic Area. And it seems to me that when I first joined the TUC in 1969, the central thing that we worried about was how do we compete with German industry? And how are we going to get productivity up? How are we going to get the investment, technology, and so on? Oh, we didn't particularly want the works councils and we didn't want the supervisory boards and so on, but we did want our companies to perform up to that level. And then we got two bonanzas. Firstly, the North Sea, which took the pressure off because all of a sudden we had a lot of money. Basically Thatcher spent it on tax cuts and paying for 3 million unemployed, by the way, wasted. Complete contrast with Norway. And then we had the bonanza of the financial services explosion in the City of London and mini Londons in Edinburgh, Leeds, Manchester and a few other places, Bristol, Cardiff, and so on. Well, we're not going to get another bonanza. It's not going to come, at least I can't see it. If anybody can, you make a lot of money. But there's no bonanzas in sight. And so the reality is back to where we were. Can we compete, not with China and the way they're going, because we can't do that, that's not a left agenda, but can we compete with the other countries of Northern Europe? Not just Germany, but the Netherlands, the Nordic countries, and Austria, and to some extent Belgium, and to some extent France. It seems to me that that model of a society, whether it's a social market, it's trying to preserve the love of the consumerism and shopping and all that has grown up in the post-war period, along with the sense of strong welfare, solidarity in the States, pretty high taxation, and very, very good benefits, and a concern about equality, which has become dangerously weak in this country over the last 30 years in particular. So it's a rather Northern European vision. That's the kind of societies we're going to aim for, that I would like to see coming out in the Labour Party conference, out of the TUC and so on. Realistic, because they've done it. They've done it. And we could do it if we put our minds to it on a collective basis with some imaginative leadership. There isn't an alternative I could see. I'm interested if any of you think there is. And it's not back to the 1945 model in all its attractiveness at that time. It's not an attractive model, I fear, now. But the idea of a balanced economy, a social market, strong welfare, strong public services, is the kind of model that I would advocate. It's not good socialism in our time. It lacks some of the rhetorical, and nobody's been in Britain has been able to give it any rhetorical flourish that's captured the imagination. Vincent Cable's probably come nearest to it in recent years. But it is the way, I think, for the trade unions of in the future. It's the way for the Labour Party in the future, and it's the way for the left in the future. Over to you. Thoughts of an old man.